Hello everyone, today we talk about the conflict between Boniface VIII and Philip IV of France. So, this is one of the great chapters of medieval history, dealing actually with several other important topics, chiefly the relations between the Kingdom of France and the Church of Rome in this period that, albeit so tormented, especially under the pontificate of Boniface VIII, were, in telling the truth, two cooperating forces. Definitely the issues of protest and protest towards the Church of Rome, its wealth, that came both from the sense of national monarchies that wanted to seize practically control of the administration of their own national churches, but also from the most, say, heterodox movements like the spirituals, these evangelic paparistic movements that were still floating there. We discussed a lot about this on Schwerpunkt, and if you want to go see, the medieval Christianity playlist, you find plenty of that. Up to now, I also made a video about Boniface VIII. It was a bit of an introduction, always in there medieval Christianity. I never discussed thoroughly the figure of Philip IV, and I believe I should start make some video on biographies proper, because usually and that's also a difficult topic to discuss, because Philip IV is this enormous. We should go straight to the sources to actually describe the person, the character, but maybe for another time. And also in here we can't but address generally this all the major implications that the clash between these two figures during at the very beginning of the very end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, began to clash against each other, because this also had to do a lot with the Roman nobility, with many aspects we can't really cover, but today we'll try to make an introduction of this, like always, and then maybe when Schwerpunkt will be a bit older we will make it tell something more in depth. So the story is actually pretty well known. As I was saying now, this conflict between the Pope and the French king is set into a moment of greater agitation, if you want, of greater in a world that was transforming extremely quickly, because the European system at this point had reached basically the apex of its dynamism, of its social complexity. Then in the first half of the 14th century everything will begin to crumble, in part down, and already this conflict between Boniface VIII and France kind of set some already many problems, especially from a political point of view, and concerning chiefly the liquefaction of the traditional political dichotomies, that is, two distinct let's say sides into the international politics that actually had never existed, but up excuse me, to this point had been more or less embodied by France and the papacy against the empire. And obviously these major, respectively, these major Guelph and Ghibelline blocks into Europe that definitely have always been very fluid, but at this time are really mixing up, because there are many powers that are kind of emerging, so many more relations, and it's impossible to reduce that to a dichotomy, Guelph and Ghibelline. Yes, generally it was like that, but everybody had essentially was leaning one time from this side, one time from the other, and there were here it's the true end of universalism. This is the general interpretation is given to this thing, and it actually stopped with at the end in the mid of the 13th century with the collapse of the with the death of Frederick II and the decline of the empire, given the dynamics. We also discussed relatively extensively on Schwerpunkt into what was the centralization of power into the Holy Roman Empire. So you can go check the Medieval Germany playlist in this case. And there was, however, also general criticism coming from Western Christianity that at this point kind of dominated almost all of Europe, because it is true Constantinople had been recovered a few years before now by the Palaiologoi dynasty, but generally speaking the French Angevin Empire was something that stretched really from the Channel to Greece, and it was something huge, and that was really the hegemonic force in Europe. So the Western Christendom had expanded its borders, its influence, and the Church had not remained outside this political and military conflicts and expansion that naturally had much controversy in. Given the nature of the Church and the general hope that had existed in previous centuries to, let's say, purify the Church of Rome from this essentially quite temporal, say, secular problems that were definitely quite distant from the strictly spiritual concerns of the Church. So this criticism, this malaise, let's say, had spread at many levels of society. And now, without getting too much into detail, in 1294, after a long moment of indecision, a new pontiff had been elected with the name of Celestine the Fifth. This person had catalyzed really all the great hopes of renewal of the Church in many ways, even though his election also was a merely political thing. Celestine was meant to be a political pawn of the Guelph bloc in many ways. Celestine V was actually before becoming Pope, he was this hermit from central Italy that actually was born at the beginning of the 13th century from a very poor family. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And I decided to undergo the hermitic life, and he retreated on the Mount Morrone, close to the city of Sulmona in Italy, and he eventually was ordered as a priest in Rome. And he was this kind of controversial figure on its own. You know, the natural vulgata that this was a pure, innocent person who was put there against his will, and that he retreated from this extremely corrupt. It's a bit, and that was the victim essentially of Boniface VIII. Is a bit overplayed as a narrative, I would say. First of all, Peter had taken under his discipline certain elements that had fled from the Franciscan order that belonged to the current of the spirituals. So these movements within the minorites that had kind of stuck more to the pauperistic model that Francis had set, but was also in this sense very strong influence from Joachim of Fiore, and that had pushed themselves for the ideal election of this kind of angelic pope that had to reform, purify the church from at the root, and so on. So these were the general expectation, but this was a kind of a very heterodox movement. And we must say that Peter was also extremely he had created this monastery on the Maiella Massif in central Italy, extremely cold place. So this was this typical hermetic experience into this wilderness in let's say in dire conditions that had to stress really. And the monastery had been framed under the Benedictine rule naturally. This community had been called of the Celestinians, and when he was elected, when Peter was elected Pope, etc., was quite actually clever to kind of strengthen his monastic foundation. I mean, he was not a person who was wholly devoid of, personal interests and completely, he was cleverer than he seemed. Definitely, he wasn't the man of politics like Boniface VIII would become, but definitely, we should stop kind of reading history just, this was the good guy and this was the bad guy, also because I personally admire enormously Boniface VIII, and as we'll see that a lot of propaganda has been written about. I mean today the historical figure of Boniface VIII in every kind of medievalistic, in any kind of academy is studied by knowing by default that we have a huge corpus of sources that have been written like many other times, many other ones of that time, as a political propaganda. Boniface VIII suffered a huge political propaganda. I'm not saying he was actually a tender soul and that he was a scrupled person. Not at all. He was definitely the ambitious, cocky, arrogant guy that he's depicted, but we should naturally understand it as nothing particularly different from whatever existed in there, except he was an extraordinary clever person, and he did also many positive things. The University of Rome, for instance, was founded by Boniface VIII. I hate when you open the internet, you want to know about figures like Boniface VIII, and you find people who simply start to tell you the story of how depraved and terrible this guy was, and they don't even state that renowningly most of what we know about him is from the typical medieval political propaganda that has been written by the colonnades and the Kingdom of France. And there was a counter-propaganda that definitely Boniface VIII wrote itself, but if you want to study history, you have to understand, in fact, this is propaganda, and every source, especially at this time, is kind of there's no thing like a free thinker in here. Everybody has an agenda. Everybody was trying to push with this propagandistic weapons for presenting a certain picture of the reality that definitely was not like it was perfectly normal. But you have to acknowledge it to study that phase of history. And aside from this propaganda, we don't know a huge much about the same figure of Boniface VIII. I mean, given the times and what kind of person he was, objectively, we unfortunately will never know. So we just have to stick to the sources for what we know they practically are, and not to let fool ourselves and by still believing what those people pretending to reconstruct reality on the base of a source that is openly about it's an openly conceived to denigrate, to draw a different picture from the one it really was. And this, by the way, tells you how medieval propaganda was effective, by the way, because it was definitely I should make a video about medieval propaganda, because most of medieval history is told through this propaganda, and you can't even understand where it starts and where it ends, because most of history has been like that. The same goes for the ancient world. Do you really pretend to study, I don't know, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, given on the base of the Flavian dynasty? Do you really think Caligula was crazy and he appointed a horse senator because he was crazy? Can't you distinguish what is a piece of political propaganda from reality? Don't you know what the context was? Don't you know how these things work? I mean, we have to try to look past behind certain things if you really want to know what the general picture really was. And it's inescapable. I mean, there are, unfortunately, because there are many people out there, I realize, cannot stop studying history without judging morally. I mean, it's fine to judge morally history. There is nothing wrong in it, but as long as you don't make history a moral judgment, because history is proper research, then you can have your own opinion, but you have to back them with evidence that takes into account dynamics about which we don't really know this excessive much. I mean, you can't criticize in this century a 14th century French king or Roman Pope on the base of, you know, what your morals are, because these were characters that were put into an environment under certain pressures within certain dynamics that they couldn't escape from. And before judging this, you should at least before understand what these dynamics were, how this worked in practice. So, well, this is a bit of my rant. I don't know how useful it is, but you can be sure that from Schwerpunkt you never hear history from at least a conscious subjective perspective, because history obviously is subjective by definition in many ways, but here you're not going to tell the story, you know, this guy was good, this other was evil, because I simply don't reason historically like that. It doesn't make sense to me in the first place. Even when you find people who were objectively evil, were objectively, say, or they did at least evil things or positive things, because it's as if you know, those things had been done just because they were evil. But you have to understand or good, but you have to understand why they occurred in the first place. Why could, let's say, an evil person could do certain things at that time? Because it's way more interesting than saying, you know, that guy was evil, point. It's as if you say Hitler is evil, but then you don't bother yourself to study what the Germany of the 30s really was. What's the point? You can find many other evil people around, all over history in the same way, but it's way more interesting in that case to know how the whole thing worked and how that evil could be carried out, for instance. So this is a bit like in here, and with the only difference that, you know, about you know, the 20th century we know a bit more in detail. About the 13th century, the 14th century, we really don't. I mean, we don't practically know what these people really were as individuals. Okay, we don't have it from the sources. We know what they did. We can try to, you know, there is a whole branch of history that I think it's taking place. I mostly saw it relatively to, let's say, late medieval and early modern diplomacy. I mean, the attempt to reconstruct the personality, the character of a certain historical figure through what this person wrote. What's the heuristic value of this? There is a whole branch that is flourishing because people buy into the delusion that it is possible to really understand things from just how I mean, about this person to which just I don't know, a diplomat wrote. But a diplomat at the time wrote in a codex with certain canons, with certain formulas that were quite mechanic. Of course, you can spot definitely the personality, what the personality really was, what kind of interests there were behind, but how can you be sure? But I mean, what's the actual historical result you're gonna obtain? And that's very difficult to do with the documents of people that really wrote quite a lot. How can you do it with just, you know, these figures in here that are mostly described by external sources that really comment on what they do on in fact on a propagandistic base? You see the inherent difficulties that exist into even defining or making the point that so many people do, like Boniface VIII was a monster, was a depraved, was a pervert even. You know, that's all colonnade propaganda. We all know that. If you want to study the figure of Boniface VIII, that's the first thing you learn, because otherwise you can't study the historical figure in the first place. But hey, no, people prefer just to know better without even knowing what they're talking about, whatever. So aside from this, and I'm not saying I'm better, because I also indulge sometimes into certain comments, but I try to always remain a bit more detached. What I would like to leave you with is mostly the idea of staying open, not to let yourself influence by what you hear from the average no one, like even me, and just to go look at the sources and really try to figure out your opinion on your own. And I realize that most of the people can't go into the sources, don't even have the interest, nor the will, nor the competence to do that. They wouldn't even know where to start from. But just be aware that there is this dimension. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a joke. You can tell and explain to other people how it is without any competence of sort. Things have to be scoped first. They have to be researched. So relatively to this Celestine V, as we were saying, towards 1284, when he was still not Pope, I mean, we were still talking about Peter of Morrone, he left a bishop at the head of his own disciples, and in 1287 had completely abandoned any superior office. So his election to the papacy actually occurred after the death of Pope Nicholas IV in April 1292, and the following conclave was essentially extremely troubled. It lasted a very long time because of the usual factional clashes that were occurring in Rome between the Orsini and the Colonna families that were kind of a bit cats and dogs at this point. The Orsini were Guelph, and they dwelled into the north of Rome. The Colonna were Ghibellines, they dwelled in the south. Rome was at this time kind of not really the far west. Actually, Rome was probably more organized than we would normally think. There are a few sources about Rome in detail but there was a kind of a local government that also still worked, etc. But famously, the Roman baronial families were extremely warlike and extremely ruthless in many ways, and the Orsini Colonna clashed continuously everywhere, and this naturally contributed to the unrest of the city, to the difficulty of control. These were factions were constantly clashing for essentially also participating participating to the ecclesiastical administration, to influence the papacy, to make their members appointed to prestigious offices, like cardinals, etc. And so the conclave basically had decided, as we've seen, the election of Peter from Morrone, and he initially didn't want to accept, but he was forced essentially into this, seemingly. So he was elected and eventually consecrated in the summer of 1294. So this election was to satisfy the hopes of those spirituals that hoped the church had to be renewed, and the pauperistic model and of the gospel, etc. And the reality, however, was extremely different. First of all, because this election had been pushed by Charles II of Anjou. So at this time, the Angevins were all one with the Church of Rome and the Kingdom of France. The Angevins were controlling southern Italy. They had a very close contact with Rome. Their armies essentially backed the Guelph party all over central and northern Italy into the Italian communes, and they had this extremely longa manus, would say that, over these events. And Charles hoped to guide Celestine V essentially to every kind of direction. By the way, Celestine at this point was pretty old. He was more than 80 years old, and he was so naive, at least up to a certain point, as we've seen, especially relatively to politics, business, and so on. So it was an extremely different world from the one he probably himself had. I mean, he probably wasn't that naive as we think, but perhaps he also felt into the illusion that this world could be a bit more spiritual than it really was. And the King of Naples at this point appointed many of his own men at the highest offices of the papal curia, and just after the Celestine consecration, he appointed 12 new cardinals, of which 7 were were French. So this was actually normal because, in part, that there hadn't been so many French, even popes at this point. This even before eventually the papal curia was shifted to Avignon a few decades later. But this wasn't really an imposition. I mean, the real problem here was mostly negotiating with the local Roman nobility that was actually quite strong, and it was, however, in part fine of the cooperation with the French, because that was the assurance, by the way, that the French Angevin power would have been available to their needs. At this point, if you look at the papal armies and the papal legates, you find there was plenty of French help, or of troops that were sent from Naples were actually quite good troops, because usually were feudal levies and heavy cavalry, and also at this point also the Aragonese, the Catalan mercenaries began to pop out. So those were quite praised professionals of war that also into Italian warfare this time were really present and effective. And at the end of the same 1294, Celestine was basically brought to Naples itself, where he he was hosted into the castle in Newcastle, Naples, that had been built by the Angevins over. Naples had 3 castles at this time. In a short time, however, Celestine wanted to basically detach himself from all of this. He didn't like evidently what what turn the path had taken. He retired himself in a small cell of wood, and he entrusted the government of the church to certain cardinals. He trusted certain cardinals that were close to him as well. And this situation could not really last for long, and it was even that this pope was not cooperating. Was not what the Angevins and the other Guelph Roman families had hoped for. So this is the moment into which Boniface VIII, Benedetto Caetani, this was his name in Italian, came into play, and also in here we don't really know actually how much was the active influence of Caetani on the removal of Celestine V. I mean, it's obvious that later he imprisoned him de facto, and he had him probably also. Well, we don't really know, but Celestine died after a few time. But also in here we say, oh well, yeah. The normal story is Boniface VIII took out Celestine V. He was so evil, he killed the guy. No, it's really no historical evidence whatsoever to say this was true. Okay, Celestine was relegated eventually into this castle at Fumone, close to Alatri, so in the south of Lazio, where also, by the way, was close to the lands of the Caetani, and definitely he died there. But that's because when Boniface was already elected, the removal of Celestine, or maybe better his abdication that we'll see happened, is really not something we can really put on Boniface VIII as such. We can't obviously ascribe just or blaming him for this. We can definitely see he was from the side that was interested into it, but there were many other actors in here that were intervening into the papal curia, and it's very difficult to look at the whole thing in detail because we have no evidence. So after only 5 months of pontificate, Celestine abdicated. He renounced solemnly to the papacy. So this followed basically into the same December 1294, the election of Boniface of Benedetto Caetani to Peter's soil. He was elected Pope with the name of Boniface VIII. This was really an anomaly up to that time. First of all, there was a huge reaction, a huge impression. It was felt naturally among those Joachimites, Corinths, that were among which also the Celestinians had been part of that. There was essentially a political backing of the same against Boniface at this point. I mean, these spirituals that were all about, in fact, allegedly about purity and ideals, actually began to back actively the enemies of Boniface VIII, the Colonna family, Boniface VIII was a Caetani, not an Orsini, but nevertheless he was a Guelph, and actually this is the point that the Colonna had backed themselves the same election of Boniface VIII, because initially they thought he was a good candidate indeed, and they could deal with him, in fact, not being necessarily part of a also in here Guelphs and Ghibellines could find certain compromises. There wasn't a sharp division between the two things. You in order to understand this dynamics, you have really to look in detail at what the local situation really was. But they basically, as it often happens, Boniface had managed to get elected, also promising certain things, and as soon as he arrived, he was elected Pope, he refused, and the Colonna got extremely damaged by this, also because the Caetani were these extremely ambitious family that really didn't look in the face of anyone, and he wanted just to expand his own dominions, even against and harming the colonnades. So at this point, the Celestinians, the spirituals, began to back the Colonna themselves, because they were the major military power in the region of Rome that could deal against Boniface VIII, who was accused of having essentially taken out this angelic pope that allegedly would have had to bring to restore the purity of the church. Very ideal things. There was a lot of politics involved also in these attitudes, and it's very there is an obvious and very famous reference we can make to this episode, that is from Dante's Inferno, where when the Tuscan poet basically essentially blamed Celestine V for having being so cowardly in practice, to have made the great refusal. He is actually he is accused of having been a sloth, and there is this passage in Dante's Inferno that really is not quite explicit about this. Dante basically names a figure among the various characters that were in hell, describing him by the one who made refusal, and nobody actually knows who he is. Naturally, the comedy is very allegorical, and there are huge references to lots of things, to the Bible, to ancient history, but also the contemporary political events. Certain people said that this figure is Pilatus. Certain people said this is Celestine V. The better interpretation is actually that it's really Celestine V being equated to the figure of Pilatus for having said, okay, I don't want to deal with this, like when it happened when he had to judge Christ, letting the Jews deciding. And so Celestine had done. Basically, he had simply refused his office, so arguably the highest office on earth, so refusing what the same God had given him the opportunity to do, and this is the moment in which according to Dante, these lots were kind of the worst figures on the whole spectrum, let's say, because at least people who made who sinned willingly and knew what they were doing, they had taken a choice. Instead, Dante hated those who didn't take a side. This has naturally, it's very interesting to understand because it shows actually how important the political commitment was in that time in history. People think sometimes even of the same Dante as a kind of a poet or a sort of artist, of a detached person. Dante was actually he was a diplomat. He fought as a knight in the first line into battle. He came from a family of moneylenders. I mean, he was an extremely mundane person, and he had his own very strong political beliefs and activity in this sense. So I realized on Schwerpunkt I never talked about Dante in detail, but here it's important to mention that in Dante's Paradise instead, the poet celebrated the abbot Joachim of Fiore, so actually taking the side of this quite heterodox figure that the same spirituals and the Celestinians were looking at with admiration. So really feeling that Celestine V had betrayed this perspective, so something extremely serious. And naturally Dante was also extremely a personal enemy of Boniface VIII, since he had expelled essentially the White Party, the White Guelph Party from Florence, after which basically Dante was obliged to go in exile. And citing, in fact, Dante was a White Guelph, but this equated that when exiled, the White Guelphs normally sided with the Ghibellines themselves. So those who actually actively fought against the Papas in this time. It was an enormous warfare, an extremely intense warfare ongoing in this time into Italy, and so you can understand how many interests were related to even these events that sometimes we treat as merely a spiritual affair, as if the Roman Curia was just concerned about the church and that's it. No, it wasn't. It was all one with politics, with military, with every kind of arguably of activity existed at the time, and the whole international balance, political balance was really based also on events that took place in here. So just to pass directly to to Boniface VIII, and completing now the history of Celestine. Now the former pope basically escaped from the guard that was essentially put. The control was put on him by Boniface, because Boniface had basically forbidden him to come back in his own hermetic seat in central Italy, and Peter now was going towards Apulia with the intention to actually embark and cross the sea. But he was eventually captured into the Gargano Peninsula, and he was handed to the local authorities that were the Angevins, and brought to Charles II of Naples. And from here he was brought to Anagni, where Boniface VIII was present at the time, and he basically put him into prison, essentially, together with some of Peter's disciples as well, in the castle of Fumone, and he died, and Peter died essentially in a few years after. Actually, I think just 1 year after, like in 1296. he was 87 at the time. So there eventually was canonized in 1313. So it was a kind of definitely was not a very nice business, but anyhow, there were more political implications that we're normally prone to say when it gets to this. So also here, for instance, what did really Boniface thought? How much was influenced? This was influenced by the Angevins. We don't really know. They were naturally acting in kind of concert together as powers, but we don't also here have the real feelings that Boniface VIII could have at this point. Because normally Boniface VIII is described as this kind of even brusque or curt and willful, determined, strong-willed person, and surely, yeah, that's kind of maybe the picture we really have, but it would be interesting to know more about this figure. So the pontificate of Boniface VIII began in fact, we have seen in the end of 1294 and would last until Boniface's death in 1303. He dealt immediately with, as we've seen, with this problem of Celestine. We don't fully know, let's repeat it if it wasn't clear enough, how directly he basically had to do with his demise, and there are good reasons to suspect he was interested, at least in it. So really, the main objective the Boniface VIII had at this point was this theocratic ideal of the papacy. So the idea of imposing the papal authority over the other secular powers of Europe. This was a very bad moment for doing it, if anything because of France. At this time there is a kind of rise of national monarchies, but not all of them were like France. Definitely France was an exception. It was the most powerful entity in Western Europe. It had a very peculiar character in political and institutional terms. France had developed since a very early age this concept of theocracy. Let's say of how do I say this? Wait a second. I can't find the term. Whatever. Let's say of mixing might go with, but between essentially the political and religious power of the French monarchy and the French Church. So a precocious nationalization of the local church, over which the same monarchy had been built actually back in the day. Now the Capetian dynasty was ruling, but you can argue that the strong alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the church was as old as Clovis in the Merovingian dynasty, and had progressively developed tendentially towards that area. There was a very strong alliance and community of interests between the French monarchy and the major ecclesiastical figures of France at the time. This happened a bit also elsewhere. I mean, this is something you can see dating back to, especially to Carolingian times, but as we've seen even before. I mean, the idea of the monarchy trying to be backed by the ecclesiastical institutions, because these were essentially the only ones that kind of had a more centralized organization. so that surely they were still ruled by the by members that came from the highest the high nobility, definitely, but that were not um, inheritable as institutions proper. They still had this bond, in fact, with Rome, that at this point was to become a problem in some ways, but that had assured, in a certain sense, that the ecclesiastical administration would remain as such, that it wouldn't kind of escape from the control of a central authority. Obviously, things were a bit different because Rome couldn't control at all times all the various ecclesiastical hierarchies, but definitely the popes had managed, and especially at this point, to extend a very robust and thick net of ecclesiastical administration all over Europe, and it was not possible at this time to escape from this articulate thing. Also because within the same church there were factions that in this sense there was always a side that was interested in maintaining contact with Rome. Also, the same church, same local church, doesn't matter how much allied with the local monarchy, was still very jealous of its own prerogatives. There were many, there were huge immunities that the church had. So that's actually why the monarchy had bet on that horse, because those were lands that were there that couldn't be touched, and they were probably the only permanent thing that existed in there, while the lay aristocracy could really be very turbulent, to vary, to be unreliable in many ways. It had less bonds. Instead, the church was interested also in here locally at being safeguarded by a central authority, so not to be harassed, for instance, by the rest of the nobility, which still happened, by the way. But it's something that happened, for instance, also in Germany. In Germany, it was like the same. The greatest sustainers, the greater supporters of the central authority, either the royal or imperial one, had been the great ecclesiastical electors that had all to lose from the disintegration of the German monarchy at this point, because they felt threatened by the aggressive lay nobility that wanted to expand its own territories at expense of the same ecclesiastical properties. Now, this is approximated, because naturally there were certain ecclesiastical lordships that also behaved differently from this, but generally speaking, the church in post-Carolingian times had usually been quite supportive of the local monarchy. France at this time, as we were saying, was the most important, the most powerful political entity in Europe. We can argue, actually, at this point. Not even in Western Europe anymore, because the Byzantine Empire had now been sensibly reduced, and as we have seen, the French Angevin Empire was something huge, was like at the acme of its power. The French, in parallel, at the same time, the empire had disgregated. I mean, up to the 12th, 13th century, Germany had been objectively more powerful than France. It doesn't matter how difficult it was, the various process of centralization and all, but at least until the Hohenstaufen dynasty had been able to maintain the unity between Sicily and Germany, the German Empire was kind of more the Holy Roman Empire was a bit more of could be definitely a competitor of France. After the disgregation of the German monarchy, with the decline of the Hohenstaufen and the proliferation of all these princely powers, the German emperor was not definitely a real threat for the French anymore. In fact, certain emperors, chiefly the Habsburgs, had been actually allies with the French, which is kind of strange because traditionally the Germans and the French had been adverse. Eventually, at the beginning, especially when the Luxembourgs were elected and the German emperors began to launch once again incursions into Italy, the French at this point were once again felt under attack into Italy, by the way, not in France. Probably now France was starting also to have certain consistent problems, because the beginning of 14th century is really a general moment of crisis. Even the German Empire, it starts coming back a bit into Italy, but also progressively shrinks and drives away from it. By the mid of the 14th century, they kind of lose the grip on the peninsula as well. So at this point, the French were actually a huge power, such a huge power that they kind of worked as an empire on their own. I mean, they were trying to substitute their to replace the Guide of Europe from the Holy Roman Empire to France in practice. So stressing prerogatives of the French kings that had very that were essentially conceived as even a sort of universal power, which is naturally very, very strange, because theoretically the Holy Roman Empire had to encompass the whole Europe. I mean, the idea that theoretically even a French or Spanish king could be elected to the title of emperor was still there. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire was de facto this kind of mostly Germanic entity, or at least it's not at this point that, I don't know, the Italians or the Burgundians or the Bohemians had risen to the throne, etc. It had always been a matter of now German dynasties ruling there. And these dynasties they had their core center of power into Germany now that especially Sicily had been lost. There was no strictly emergence of an empire from both the German and Italian soil. So France at this point felt eligible as theoretically as a Western Christian power to even to the role of rulers of the West. And after all, they had always thought it was like that. The same empire had been born into Francia proper. I mean, it would be interesting also in here. This is a chapter that never deepened more than much, but I suspect I would like to learn, for instance, more about how the French consider themselves still part of the heirs of the Carolingians and of the imperial dignity in a way, especially now that in fact the German Empire had crumbled and they were de facto the strongest power around. So the national monarchies headed by France were essentially trying to release, to free in a certain way their own sovereignty from the imperial supremacy, and trying to claim part of that imperial prerogatives for their own, as if they were universal powers on their own. And the same goes this was very delicate because it entailed that the same refusal had to do also with the papal influence on their political affairs, and they naturally tended to reduce the papal influence on their internal matters, especially for things that were not for matters that were not strictly religious. This is important because, as we have seen, the papacy had emerged victorious twice from the clash with the Holy Roman Emperors. The Concordate of Worms in 1122 had put an end, theoretically at least, to the clash for investitures, and it had turned into a compromise essentially, but the papacy had basically obtained formally by the same imperial and hence public power the prerogatives of control, having certain temporal prerogatives, and after the clash against the Hohenstaufen, they also gained this enormous power by having proved that they could win over the empire. Now, the real problem was that when the Hohenstaufen had crumbled, the French had taken over, and as soon as basically the Angevins had conquered the Kingdom of Sicily, the papacy had understood that maybe the Swabians weren't, that terrible thing they had tried to depict, and now the Angevins being essentially possibly even worse than this. So it was a huge influence also of France on the papal matters that evidently the papacy didn't like excessively much. We have seen how the papacy was a protege of the Kingdom of France at this point. But at the same time, they wanted to maintain their own prerogatives, to expand their power into central Italy, and even if there was a lot of cooperation with the French powers, including with the election of French popes and all, still the Church had maintained this kind of Italic-oriented dimension that tended to favor to keep out from Rome and from the Papal States all the various external forces. Now Boniface VIII was trying to essentially re-extend the theocratic model over Europe, and tried and it came to go in direct clash with this new universalistic policies that especially the Kingdom of France was building for its own. So the main problem in here is that Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, Philippe le Bel in French, etc., had cancelled the immunities from the royal impositions of which the Church enjoyed. So in France, basically, the French immunities had been of the local church. The immunities of the French Church had been kind of eliminated, at least from what concerned the possibility of a royal intervention. And the main reason for this had always been financial reasons. The Kingdom of France was enormous and definitely was very powerful, but it also needed a lot of money to work. And now the main problem was to find resources to finance chiefly war. France at this time was growing. They were keeping its warfare with England. They would venture into other expeditions. The same Philip IV essentially come out, had been elected and had to disengage from a conflict with Aragon. Now the Flanders were the main target of the French. So extremely costly policies that required a freaking lot of money. So at the time, as we know, feudal powers were not excessively centralized, and basically the greatest a power like France, it was, let's say, the most structured one. It was the one who tried at a larger level to impose new taxes, new tolls, and to find essentially new forms of revenue from the kingdom. And definitely the French church was extremely wealthy, and that was definitely a very inviting source of income. The French, many times now, they wiped out, the French monarchy wiped out the Templars, as they were also extremely wealthy. They had an enormous quantity of houses, of lands, of properties all over France. So by eliminating them and confiscating their goods, they really made a lot of money with that. Sometimes now the French monarchy confiscated also the goods of the Lombard merchants that were prominent into France. This went, telling the truth, these weren't also, they don't have to be judged necessarily as negative or evil policies. Definitely also in here, talking about medieval propaganda, that we've seen how important it is. We tend to say, oh, look at how evil was Philip IV. He killed all the Templars, he robbed he persecuted the Jews, he sacked the Lombards, he was just a terrible ruler and all this stuff. Well, it's not really so, because you have really to believe how difficult it was to finance this kingdom, to make it work, because that's the main problem. It's not a problem of saying, okay, I want to become richer because I already have money. These powers in the Middle Ages were chronically short of money, and it would remain for centuries, because they didn't have enough. They didn't have an enough centralized system that could allow them to draw resources on a regular basis from the local communities. Telling the truth, the French at this time, also thanks to the same papacy and the conquest of the Kingdom of Sicily, had begun to develop more functional bureaucracy. Philip IV is famous for having essentially expanded this bureaucracy on the papal model, because they took this from the papal curia that also under Boniface VIII was very much expanding. It was, so just not for saying that, you can argue that modern bureaucracy was created at this time in history in Rome and in the Angevin kingdom. So this entailed a huge effort to impose also these exactions, these collections, and the French were kind of forced to recur also to more drastic means to really find the money, because you can't really do about anything about, if you don't have enough if you're insolvent, basically you can't do anything. Nobody's gonna finance you. You don't have the money to even pay your soldiers. You can't move around, so you get kind of frozen, and then the system collapses. So you necessarily have to find new revenues, and this is, by the way, how most of the national monarchies at this time operated, also with very mean and violent and debatable and controversial means, but these were crucial to ensure that at least for a certain time, that amount of resources that were necessary to breathe once again. Okay, so it's obvious that the Caesaro-papistic, let's say, ambitions of the French kings were also structured ideologically, not just on the influence that, let's say, the French political theory had, let's say, the tradition of the French political theory, but also they were conceived to back and to justify these necessary evils, let's say, into to collect new resources. So even with the Templars, we've seen it before. It was a huge. If you confrontate the propaganda that existed in France, for instance, the one against Boniface VIII, or the one against the Templars, you realize that the accusations were remarkably similar. I mean, the political propaganda at that time was pretty homogeneous. There were a series of standard accusations, like to be a sodomite, like to be an heretic, like to be unfit for some other way, and that was seen as the justification for carrying out certain thing. And objectively, in here you say, oh, look at how evil they were. Yeah, but it wasn't just a matter of being evil. It was a matter of saying, okay, if we have to do this thing, let's really try to justify it, because evidently this was also very important. The people had to have a reason for the king behaving in a certain way. So if the king wanted, as we will see now, to punish the Pope, to put it under trial, to stem this influence over the French affairs, it was necessary for in my medieval mindset that this Pope would be unfit, because what are you going to mistreat? A pious Pope, a holy Pope? It obviously has to be a deviated, a pervert, and you have to create that image through propaganda. The same goes with Templars. These Templars had not done anything, arguably. They were conceived as heretics, as people were treasonous, treacherous, sorry, and that had committed the worst atrocities, because that's how you can justify wiping them out, burning them at the stake, and confiscating all their goods. And this is important because it proves, by the way, among other things, that medieval society was pretty much concerned about such justifications. I mean, you couldn't do such an effort, today I can't find a word, heinous, atrocious, wicked action without having a justification, because otherwise you would have been seen as a bad ruler. So it was perceived. Obviously, people were not naive at the time. They knew why such things were happening. But it's a bit like today. You know, there is that politician that really tells you his agenda, that the other politician is evil and corrupt and stupid and so on. You don't care what reality is really about. The important is that your guy is essentially blasting the other guy, and it is so at this time, and in our times, it was so in those times. So this has necessarily to be understood, because if you take this as mere one day the French king wiped out the Templars because he needed money, and you're obviously saying, oh, why this guy was so evil. But if instead you frame it in the actual needs of the French kingdom, of the world international situation, of all the pressure that existed from every side, enemies everywhere, wars going on, necessity to react, you can start not to justify this morally, which is not our point, but at least to motivate it and say, okay, was it something that eventually produced results? Was this necessary? What would have happened if this had not been carried out? This is how you have to reason. Otherwise, it's just you sitting on a chair and pointing the finger on people that lived 700 years ago. You feel you need to feel better than them because I don't know. That improves your ego and makes you feel to be wise, to be pure. Most likely, you're a scumbag, and those people were instead trying to make something that worked, also for a greater purpose that we can debate, we can definitely question morally, but that it's not very different from sometimes what we do today, also to justify certain things. You always have to stick to the context, because otherwise it's just you being an asshole with history without even knowing that. And I think it's even before than managing. Then let's say than judging history, always try to understand history before. And you'll understand that in order to understand history not even a lifetime is enough. So time spent judging is time wasted for something you don't even have the time in your life to do. That is to finally having a clear picture of what history really is, that nobody of us really can achieve. But definitely we can get closer to that the more we study it day by day. This is really an important thing in my opinion. And you understand I'm quite opinionated about this, and I realize that I'm quite controversial myself, because it sounds, by certain standards, that I'm justifying these people. I'm not justifying them. These were awful people, even for my standards, but that's not the point. I want to look at if what they did was something that served to make this world's political systems work better or not. Arguably, all the people at the time were essentially bad people for our moral standards, okay? Because it was easy to justify lots of things at that time, which this propaganda actually proves in part. But never reason through that propaganda. I mean, try to do it if you want really to make it also sort of to understand better how the minds of the time really was, why this propaganda was built in that way. But always reflect that this propaganda was an extremely pragmatic tool that was used also in a very kind of homogeneous way from both sides, so that the same accusations you find in the process in the trial against the Templars are kind of the same accusations you find in the trial against Boniface VIII. So it's the same thing. And if you look the same papal propaganda, you will find similar things against their enemies. It's the same old thing. It was kind of the standard that everybody felt the need to use for such in such political circumstances. So obviously this also proves how much effective medieval propaganda was, as we were saying before. Still, for people to be so gullible to make it believe it even today, even we as a civilization have written oceans of inks about how this was actually propaganda, and we still have people in our world that do not understand this, because it's really what they wanted to make you believe, and they wanted to make believe the people in those times. I think we can try to do a bit past that now after 700 years. So the Pope was definitely Boniface VIII definitely opposed Philip IV actions in France. He ordered the French clergy not to pay any single cent without the specific papal specific authorization. This happened in 1296. So at this point, Philip reacted by preventing that the money from the tithes collected by the church could reach Rome. So he actually began to block the personnel that was used to bring the French church's tithes to Italy, or along the way, I mean, up to Rome. And he was, and Philip also was a pretty, he never curbed. He had at this point Boniface VIII even threatened to excommunicate him, and he didn't give a damn. That's very important because it tells you how much was on the table at this point. So there was a finally sort of compromise, between the two sides. An agreement when the French king was recognized by Rome the right of taxing the clergy in the occasion of particular emergencies that could occur. Now this was a very kind of debatable thing, because at the point at that point the matter was really determining what is an emergency and whether you can do it or not. But also in here it wasn't something so categorical, because in any case, when the French king wanted to collect a certain amount of money from the French clergy, it still entailed unavoidably the negotiation with the Church of Rome. It's not that the French king could really do everything as it pleased. Also because obviously he didn't. That was his own goal, but there were so many other agents, let's say, into the international scenario that could oppose such a decision, even and especially within the same French kingdom, because naturally the local church wasn't excessively happy to do this, although surely a part of the French clergy could really say, okay, well, this is maybe, if it's the same exaction that we owe to Rome and we give it to the king, it might go. But this naturally instead could not be tolerated by Rome. So some of these clergymen felt definitely that now they had to start to pay both to the church and both to the king. So in here they probably took sides, not to pay one or the other as well, so not to increase taxation. So this this diatribe was definitely very damaging also for the figure of the church at that time. Now, since the imperial authority was almost non-existent at this point, nobody really cared, because at this point it was just a conflict within the hegemonic bloc in Europe, and it was their own business. But naturally, as a general idea, the French king and Roman Church debating on this matter was something that really worried in part the whole say disgruntled, dissatisfied and disappointed the same Christian community that, as we have seen at the time, was still also not entirely devoid of this kind of evangelic pauperistical movements that were criticizing essentially the fitness of the clergy because of all this money flowing to their hands and having to being so much directly involved into political and military matters. So in the year 1300, in order to, let's say, to lift up again the image of the church, and to stress to reinforce once again its own in front of the community of the faith of the believers, her own role of dispensator of salvation. Boniface VIII announced the first holy year or jubilee. Now, the jubilee is a term that it was among the ancient Jews. It was the holy year. It was known as the Yobel year because it was literally the year of the goat. Because this festivity, this festival was basically announced by the sound of a goat's horn. And it happened every 50 year. And so in this, according to the Mosaic law, this prescribed that the land of which God was the unique owner was not cultivated and could come back to the ancient owner, and that the slaves could have their own freedom. So naturally, this was at this point in the Middle Ages was a very different thing, and it basically was an occasion to grant the indulgence, the plenary indulgence, so the forgiveness for all the sins to all those that would have gone to Rome to pray on the tombs of the apostles after having received the Holy Communion. So this was a great way also to make money. Before we said that these were all these sovereigns at this time were desperate with money, and definitely announcing a jubilee equated to expecting to Rome a huge lot of pilgrims, more than the ones that already came to Rome habitually. So coming in Rome, being hosted in there, for them to spend money and to live in there. So lots of wealth that was about to flow into the Roman market, into the papal trunks, treasure chests. So this was the idea, that if you went to Rome, this could really and you participated to this activity, you got communicated, you prayed on the apostles' tombs, you could really be absolved from all your sins. So now this, as at the time, like in other times, was criticized because it naturally was seen as a sort of mercification of the sacraments and so on. But nevertheless, the Jubilee had a huge success that was achieved thanks, in this sense, to the pontifical initiative, and were at the time literally hundreds of thousands of pilgrims that came from let's say, the most remote corners of Christianity just to come to Rome. And at the same time, however, the Jubilee probably, especially from a strictly political point of view, didn't help the Pope to recover the political role to which he really was aiming at. And this was evident especially after a while when the conflict with Philip IV started once again. In fact, Philip IV had arrested the bishop of Pamiers, Bernard VIII. So Bernard VIII was a French bishop, and he died eventually in 1311. I don't think we even know when he was born, and he was coming from a very prestigious families of the Viscounts of Toulouse. So this area where the French monarchy had successfully expanded since the mid, that had been incorporated from the mid of the 13th century after the Albigensian Crusades, where they had those regions kind of came back and forth under the control of the French king, and finally they were inherited by the monarchy. He was an Augustinian monk and abbot of Saint Alban of Pamiers, and in 1295 he had become bishop of Pamiers, as Boniface VIII had essentially created dioceses in here, oppositely for him. So, in this sense, Bernard VIII was defending the papal prerogatives, the ones that were claimed at least at this point, with so much political meaning entailed. So Philip IV had accused Bernard of treason and had him arrested. So the Pope ordered him to set him free, and this produced the bull Ausculta Fili of December the 5th, 1301, which essentially started the second phase of the conflict, as we've seen, with between the French king and the Roman Pope. So the Ausculta Fili was essentially energically reproaching the French king Philip the Bel for not having kept into account actually the a previous bull that had been emanated in 1296 in the occasion of the first clash. It was the Clericis Laicos. So the Clericis Laicos, the Pope had appealed to certain conciliary canons to essentially to launch certain accuses more or less explicitly to Philip IV and his own politics, through which he had tried, in fact, to submit the Church to the secular power, eliminating the immunities and say the ecclesiastical and immunities and autonomies, and to prevent the autonomous jurisdiction of the local church. And that's the one through which the Pope had basically prevented the French clergy to not to grant anything to the local civil power without the permission of the Holy See, and threatening essentially excommunication and deposition for the same clergy that would have done such a thing. And from the other hand, also forbidding the the civilian powers to impose these taxes under the threat of excommunication. So now with the Ausculta filing in 1301, Boniface VIII was lamenting the lack of obedience of Philip IV towards the Pope. The Ausculta fili is also the kind of a theocratic, it's a synthesis of the theocratic doctrine of Boniface VIII, and into which the pontiff was stressing that his own supremacy was not just confined to the spiritual power, but it had also extended on the temporal power. In France, this bull was raped and burned sacredly, so that it could not be copied initially when it was read by the king, and it was basically reformulated in a way that into which the content was faked. Interestingly, so we live in the age of fake news, but you understand that this had always existed in practice. So Philip IV had this bull re-edited under the name of Deum Timor Scirete Volumus. So basically to cause a counter-reaction within the French population against the pretense, say the demand of Boniface to subjugate the kings to in their own prerogatives, in his own temporal prerogatives. So actually dusting off those same problems that had occurred into the clash for investitures. So this action was really kind of the a point of non-return in many ways, because both powers were essentially accusing of each other and completely actively moving to annihilate the others' the respective prerogatives. So the French king recurred also to another weapon that was very important in France. That were the so-called general states. So that is the assembly of the representatives of the nobility, the clergy, and the gentry, let's say, the bourgeoisie. So the he had the general states proclaimed in 1302 that the royal prerogatives descended directly from God, without that the papal mediation was rendered necessary for them to be recognized, to be instated. So this was also very important, because it was basically showing that the whole French system, represented by the general states, was backing the king's prerogatives from a political point of view within the same kingdom, in fact, and that to this adding a sort of national, say, as you want to call it, tone that was trying to get rid of external interference. So at this point, the Boniface VIII emanated the more famous, probably the most famous encyclic of this time, that is the Unum Sanctum Ecclesia, also commonly known as Unum Sanctum. So to make it simple, first of all, this was an encyclic that was encyclical, sorry, not an encyclic, that was on the wake of the positions expressed by Gregory VII and Innocent III. So it was essentially reasserting that the papal power was superior to the one of every other sovereign, and therefore nobody could judge that the Pope could basically judge everyone, but at the same time being judged in turn exclusively by the divine judgment. So basically, the idea was I can't judge anyone because the only person who can judge me is God. So this was a way to stress the moral superiority of the papacy over every other single ruler on earth. And through this, obviously, also political action could be justified. So a political, essentially an intervention in political matters, in temporal matters, as you want to call them, was essentially it was essentially questionable because every action that was political could be seen as essentially having a moral side at every moment. So basically, every single political action could be questionable from an ethical point of view by the Pope, and this meant that the papacy could interfere practically in every single decision, and in theory controlling the whole Christendom. Naturally, this wasn't feasible, but it was important from a legalistic point of view to stress these prerogatives. And in fact, at this time, if you really think about it, such decision of Boniface VIII was rather anachronistic. Or better, it was maybe excessively much. Surely at the time, such ideas were criticized by many people who weren't even the same French king, but also their opposers. Think about the Ghibellines and all. They're saying, okay, Boniface VIII is an heretic. He's a he is blasphemous and unfit for his charge, etc. But also in the past, there had been similar remarks during the clash for ambassadors or during the papal Swabian conflict, so that all the time, also in here, the Pope was called, the opponents called each other heretics or blasphemous, etc. The point is really understanding the importance, according to me, of this ideological conflict in this specific historical period, because sometimes we reason as if these national monarchies had necessarily to expand, they had necessarily to stress such prerogatives, and but at the time, actually, France was pretty much ahead of its time. You can argue that the greatness of Philip IV was at many levels, and that's why we should have to talk about him. Being kind of first sovereign, or at least among the first figures of the Middle Ages that kind of dealt with and fully accepted the end of universalism, and was pushing for a more modern centralization of power. So exploiting a condition into which the rise of the national monarchy, the weakening of the empire, was essentially making the world also losing confidence in the universalistic model that otherwise was pretty much alive. And by the way, the French had been some of the greatest supporters of this kind of universalistic order, and now they were kind of using the same in part to stress their own prerogatives. They weren't doing it from a very opportunistic point of view, so not really believing in universalism proper, in the usual dichotomy, papacy, empire, etc., but going beyond. It's kind of expanding in a more with a more lay mindset, with a more secular mindset, with a more modern mindset, if you want, to reinforce their own monarchy, and therefore strengthening their own factual power in a world that otherwise was still kind of elaborating this, even the same concept of centralization, because political theory worked, and political practice, especially in other countries, worked in different ways. And France was the cradle of this development exactly because it was the most advanced country from a political and institutional point of view at that time, at least as a great monarchy. So this is not really surprising. And the Unum Sanctum is makes up actually the same last episode of conflict between the spiritual and secular power, and which would have not been essentially conceived anymore. And these theories were very old. I mean, the idea of the the doctrine of two swords, for instance, is something that starts since Pope Gelasius I in the 5th century, that always stressed the firm distinction between the two spheres, the secular and spiritual one, and the ecclesiastical one, but with the primacy of the latter over the first. So with the consequence of the superiority of the papacy over the empire, and not as equal powers. The novelty of the Unum Sanctum consists, however, in the fact that also in here the figure of the emperor is actually replaced. Of the emperor as a universal power is substituted by the one of the French king. This is very interesting because not only shows really what kind of power France had achieved at that point, but also the same papacy was kind of recognizing that implicitly. Also because while these two figures were clashing, the alliance between the French power, the French empire, let's say, and the papal and the Roman Church did not come to an end. This was an internal matter. The enemies of this bloc were always the same. They didn't split up into, this thing didn't escalate into warfare, into the collapse of the Guelph bloc. Not at all. Surely these relations were quite stirred, but the whole strategical interests kind of remained pretty much the same. So now we could go in detail how Boniface essentially was reusing the doctrine of two swords, as in the Unum Sanctum it's quoted essentially the episode of the Gospel of Luke that tells how Jesus, before going into the Gethsemane, essentially. So the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't know how to say it in English. Accepted practically two swords for the defense of his own person. So it says in Luke 22:38, and they said, "Lord, here is two swords." So Boniface VIII with this was underlying how the kind of the unicity of the church through a very peculiar allegory that he states in the Unum Sanctum, that quoting, translating, at the time of the deluge, I don't know how you say that in... Why don't I translate these things before starting? So before the deluge, yes, because there was, I mean, and really was the Ark of Noah was only one, and it represented the unique church, and this was made up, built up with only one arm, that had only one helmsman and only one commander, that is Noah. And we read that before of the ark, everything over the earth was destroyed. So in this quote you realize that there is a repetition of the term one only, and so this was aimed to stress the unicity of the church from a spiritual point of view. So God is recognized in only one church. So the division between also here what was happening in the Roman church in the French one wasn't really felt as a very serious thing. So the idea here was Boniface stressing, I rule over the whole church. Nobody can tell me what I can do in this matter, and by stressing instead that everything on the earth was destroyed during the deluge except for from Noah's Ark, he underlined the importance and the necessity of the church also for the good order of humanity from essentially a secular point of view, in the sense that when everything crumbles, like it had happened during the universal deluge, it was the church that was in charge of basically of the whole destiny of humanity ultimately. So outside the single church, there is no salvation. Church is a mystical body with only one head, that is Jesus Christ. The theory of the two swords is actually stated in the traditional way, that is essentially that one sword goes to the church and another one goes to the secular power as well, but the secular power is subordinated to the ecclesiastical one, just like the secular one is judged by the spiritual one. And also this happens within also the same church, because for instance the bishops are judged by the Pope, the priests are judged by the bishops, so there is a hierarchy that has to follow necessarily. So there can't be also, for the same unity of Christianity, in a head that is not two powers that are completely equal, because this would mean this would be to contrast. So this is what the Pope was stressing in this point, the idea that there couldn't be two parallel powers without a central direction. And the Pope was stressing also the principle of a nemine judicatur, so nobody could be judged. The Pope could not be judged by anyone. A nemine judicatur means literally not to be judged by anyone, but only by God. So it's kind of a convenient, naturally, idea. So the astonishing conclusion is that at the strict ends of salvation, every single creature was submitted to the Pope. Now, aside from this, you really have to think how much ideological production this entailed. I mean, this wasn't Boniface writing it on his own desk. There were many prestigious theologians who contributed to this creation. Now, these were all men of Boniface, and there was the Franciscan Cardinal Matthew of Acquasparta and the Augustinians, Egidius Romanus and James from Viterbo, who had all written very important works already stressing the full power of the papacy and the theocracy of the Church of Rome. So I'm sorry we have to skip, things not going excessively in detail here, but it's important to at least get a broad picture of the thing. At this point, this was really a point of non-return, as we said before. So at this point, Philip IV decided to make an extremely bold attempt to build up a trial against the Pope, and putting the Pope in front of a French tribunal. This is another extreme thing. It was extremely eloquent, because at this point a French tribunal was essentially taking the Pope in front of it and demanding him to respond. So you can imagine how the concept of France proper was being believed. I mean, it's as if really France had inherited the imperial authority here and acting as a sort of universal power in front of which Boniface had to answer. Not strictly like this, but definitely putting France at such a high level of importance to even demand a universal power like the Pope to respond of the usurpation of Peter's chair, St. Peter's chair. So at this point the French try to capture Boniface VIII, and they sent Philip IV sent a military contingent into Italy to go take Boniface, and this contingent was headed by one of the greatest figures and one of the stricter collaborators of the king, Guillaume of Nogaret. So Guillaume of Nogaret is actually a jurist, but he was, as many jurists at the time, also very strictly involved into political matters, and he was in fact also, just like Boniface, he had his own theologians that were extremely skilled in law and stuff like that as well. He was working for Philip IV to stress the autonomy of royal power, essentially from any other power. And so he was sent to deal with the Pope also from a juridical point of view, not just, but definitely with this armed retinue that had to physically oblige the Pope to come to France. So at this point, these troops reached Anagni in southern Lazio, that is the region of Rome, in 1303. This was this happening, invading essentially the domination of the Caetani, the domains of the Caetani, where in those times the papal curia was being shifted. You know, the papal curia at this time was pretty mobile. Many people say, oh well, the curia was moved eventually from Rome to Avignon, as was such a, but telling the truth, the papal curia had always been it had rarely been in Rome, telling the truth. It had been around, especially these cities into central Italy, and it was normal to having this shifts, as also sometimes it was very risky to stay in Rome, as political military events were very turbulent. So what happened in the there's a beautiful papal palace in Anagni, by the way, where these events took place. I had the luck to, I remember I was a kid, I visited that. It was very fascinating. So according to tradition, actually nobody knows what happened really in there also, but it is told that Boniface was insulted by the French, and that at this time he was even slapped by the famous military commander Sciarra Colonna. Now the Colonna had basically joined with their own military retinues the French contingent, so that what a better occasion to join the enemy of your bitterest enemy to go give him a lesson. So this thing of the episode of the history of the slap of Sciarra Colonna, possibly also with an iron gauntlet, so not really a normal slap, but really theoretically something very strong, is a bit of a myth, telling the truth. It's really not very plausible that someone could slap the Pope, even if he was exposed essentially to the will of these people. It's a metaphor to say that he was slapped morally, to really show the papacy who was in charge in there. The Sciarra Colonna belonged. He was one of the greatest military commanders of the time. His family had been basically deprived of much of his lands and properties by Boniface VIII. So they hated his guts, and they had Boniface had even razed to the ground the Colonna's headquarter of Palestrina, and dispersed salt over the ashes. So just like the Romans did with Carthage back in the day. It was they had been some of the greatest opponents of the Caetani, as we've seen, in spite they had backed them initially. They had been back in the same election of Boniface VIII in time. Then basically Boniface had betrayed them, and that's why the same Colonna began to produce this extremely fascinating political propaganda against Boniface. So saying the worst imaginable things, that it was an heretic, there was a sodomite, it was a pedophile, etc. And I repeat, this is average. These are average accusations in that world. Every time you wanted to declare someone unfit, you just said that he was a pervert, that he was an heretic. That's it. That's how it worked. But this propaganda is extremely fascinating. By the way, we have certain documents about this, and there is even quite interesting evidence. It's interesting that it was produced also partly by the same Colonna, not just by the French. Unfortunately, like in any other occasions in the Middle Ages, we don't really know at the oral level what this propaganda really consisted of, because we really have to imagine it. Agents sent everywhere at this point, proclaiming this infamous accusations all over the population, that obviously most of which could not read. At least, I don't know, in Rome maybe. Well, of course, yeah, there was a high literacy at that time, but definitely it was still a word that lived much with the oral. Also much of the legal practice was based on these public proclamations. So that was equally important, and unfortunately we have no trace of that, just from the written documents. anyhow, Boniface made it to get out of this thing because he was actually freed in the meanwhile by the same inhabitants of the city of Anagni, and this prevented him from being deported to France. And so, however, seemingly this terrifying episode had shattered him so much that he died a few months later. And we can say that with Boniface VIII, the theocratic, the hierocratic, at least, project of the church that had been still kind of been burning under the ashes by a certain sense, kind of declined. Because after this, and also for reasons that really have not to do strictly with the conflict now, but I mean the death of Boniface VIII proper, the world was really changing. Especially during the first half of the 14th century, was a brusque contraction of the power of the universal powers as such. The empire, the papacy, France kind of shrank. Germany kind of bailed out from Italy, definitely. The papacy was shifted to Avignon. The papal states kind of began to crumble. France got engulfed into the 100 Years' War. So this was made of great despair. Then the Black Death arrived. I mean, it was really a great... there was a huge change at this point into medieval society. You can argue that up to the mid of the 14th century, universalism kind of survived, even institutionally speaking, because it arrived from a world that had not been sensibly changed. It had overly expanded, definitely, but on those premises. With the mid of the 14th century, it's as if, I can't say modern mentality kicked in, because obviously that would be false, mistaken as a consideration. But this world really came to an end. There was a great shock. There was a great, even thinking from a psychological point of view, I mean the idea of living through experiences like the Black Death, and especially with the knowledge of that time, that is not something you can really rationalize and interiorize so easily. But it's as if after that moment, towards the late Middle Ages, Europe kind of reshaped under this, if you want, this smaller powers, even more functional under a certain point of view, that kind of began to take even a sort of more national direction, that didn't really believe in universal institutions anymore. The papacy eventually, from the first half of the 15th century, began to reshape itself as a state in the papal states, and to reconquer all these central and northern Italian domains, kind of forming a state on their own. The empire kind of got a bit more structured in maintaining always this kind of federal orientation that really didn't make a single dynasty emerging, if not at a provincial level, like with the Habsburgs, etc., that eventually were to expand more even outside the borders of the empire than within. France was the one that kind of came back more strongly after the, in the second half of the 15th century, after the end of the 100 Years' War, and that kind of remained eventually for most of modern and contemporary history, the hegemonic power in Europe, always trying to swallow everything that was around her. But that moment between, in fact, the mid of the 14th and the mid of the 15th century was crucial in many ways to modernize, even to secularize the European mindset. not excessively, because many things obviously about the religious worldview remained pretty much alive, even up to very recent times, actually. But this strict concept of the universalism, of the idea that don't get me wrong, universalism as a theory remained instated. The problem is that the reality was essentially different from that, because it was evident that the papacy and the empire during that time could not extend practically their own power into the all over the Christendom. So if this was the evidence, the idea is what is, the average believer would obviously see how different reality was from theory, and therefore stopping to kind of believe in it in a certain measure. So this is important because it really kind of it helped to shape even, in fact, the modern mentality. In the modern age as we conceive it. Having this idea of being essentially an individual political entity is important, is something that emerges more or less from this time as a normal political practice. And yeah, so I don't know how well I managed to tell this, but I think I made some important points that I also had kind of forgotten about. Just sorry, sometimes I stop because I don't know a word, but I hope that the general pictures was clear. And as always, I'm sorry I have to skip over extremely important topics that deserve much more attention. You'll notice that I don't go extremely much in detail with every single thing, despite it takes me still a lot to say this. But this is how I'm doing things on Schwerpunkt now, because I want to give kind of this introductory background, this very more extensive than intensive information now. I just want to cover everything, to get everything well in the essentials, and then eventually in the future taking this another step and going deeper in the single perspectives. That's why, for instance, I don't tell much about biographies or some, because I still tend to draw a systemical picture of the world. It's as if this was a huge basic course, let's say, of medieval history. It's a bit more than that, because now definitely I've been talking way more than a university class about that, but and I will keep doing it. I don't know for how much time. Actually, I calculated I could go on like this for years, but there will be a point in which I will eventually stop and kind of get a bit more in detail in every single thing, which, well, at that point it's really up to me. But let's say that aside from the strictly military topics that sometimes I treat in more detail, now it's important to get a broad picture of the wall. And this was let's say, the idea is that the more videos I make about this topics, and the more you can find other contents that are kind of related to it. You often hear it now that when I talk about a certain topic, especially at the beginning of the video, I say, okay, if you are interested about this, you can go look at this video already made, and so, because the objective is that when you look, you listen to one of these videos, you can, and you got curious about something, you can find other videos in which I got a bit more in depth into this other topic that is related, that can help you understanding what I'm talking about. So it's really important. I'm trying to weave this all up with other videos, so that hopefully every time you, I don't know, like in this case, you hear about Philip IV or Boniface VIII, you have other videos you can go and watch about them, or about related topics that can help you to understand the wall as such. It's as if I was very slowly, very progressively building up sort of net you can scope, and it's going. I don't have so many views, but I have an interesting video length. An interesting watch length, and also subscribers are increasing. So I don't really know what. I guess I'm obviously always open to suggestions, because I necessarily need to know what you think about this, because I realize you might or not be interested in what I say, and especially I see it from the analytics that I get less views obviously when I talk about general medieval history than when, for instance, I deal with strictly military matters. That also depends, but tendentially it's like this. So it's as if I can perceive that you on average are less interested about this general medieval history topics than others. For instance, I get way more visualizations if I talk about Roman history. That is kind of, it's good also because this entails, by the way, Byzantine history that I also discuss sometimes. But also these topics are kind of interesting and important, and I spend so much time on them because I think they're important to bring them a little bit up compared to others, and I care really about the people to absorb this, to grow aware of such dynamics, and really not to tell them as fairy tales, like small stories or anecdotes, and especially I hate when certain historical characters are stereotyped in a fashion that reminds one of, of gossip, rather than history, and I sense I get a bit polemical when I meet with these interpretations, because sometimes it's difficult for me to really make a point without falling out of balance, essentially, and saying, okay, in order to stress a concept, I really extremize it. Not so much, because I always, just like now, for instance, I try always to balance it in some way after, but I like to sometimes to say really the opposite thing, to make you reflect on how there is that other perspective. Then obviously you choose, because you're not here to learn my personal opinion. You're probably here just because I tell these stories that can be interesting. I don't know what is that you find interesting about them, but since they are strictly historical topics, I think you are definitely interested in them, as you're interested about the historical information that I try very with great difficulty and to provide. I say with great difficulty because you see right now I always feel the need to specify that history has to be always presented more in depth. I realize that nobody does 2 hours long videos on YouTube, and that is kind of strange that I do. I came up with this formula, but this really starts from the need of really going a bit beyond what you usually hear from the average thing you can find on YouTube. Now I chose YouTube as a platform because it happened to me to search for certain topics on on YouTube, and I figured out there was nothing about that. So if so many people watch YouTube, and then they kind of get influenced by this absence of information. So whatever. For now, I just stop it. And I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.